everyone watching, and thank you for tuning into Community Table Talk. Very excited as this will be released in June, and we are celebrating Pride Month. And thank you to our guests joining us today. We have Erin McLaren from ACCKWA, and we have Rebecca Warren from Kitchener Housing. So thank you both and for taking the time to share your knowledge and your time with us today. And I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that the land on which I host this from today, which is Waterloo Region, is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I also acknowledge the deep traditional knowledge and enduring presence and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. So let's jump right into it. And this is a big, broad question that we hear quite often. Well, we're looking at terminology and, we're using the term 2SLGBTQ+ today. What do those letters stand for? And why do we not just use an overarching term like the gay community?
To answer the hopefully relatively simple part of that question, those letters stand for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. And then there's that plus on the end to indicate also that there are many other identities and terms that people use within the 2S LGBTQ community that aren't encompassed in those letters as well. And so in that vein of things, using this kind of collection of different abbreviations of terms helps us to encompass the fact that there are so many different experiences within the 2S LGBTQ community, and really one word, let alone even all of these many words that we've kind of shortened down into this acronym, really doesn't capture the full diversity of all of the individuals and experiences that make up the 2S LGBTQ community. So that's part of the reason that this is kind of the term that has been landed on, or the way that we refer to the community. I also hear people talk about the rainbow community, which I am fine with, and is another kind of reasonable way that people refer to gender and sexual diversity. But moving away from things like, selecting one term out of that sort of collection, something like the gay community is generally seen as being positive, because historically, I think there's been this desire to really reduce gender and sexual diversity down to kind of a simple understanding of what it is. And in that, we lose a lot of the richness of people's experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree with Erin's explanation there. And I think it does kind of, what I was going to mention is that it does kind of focus just on the gay community, and not every person identifies as gay. I think now, in 2021, a common term used is queer. And that's, it all depends on the person as well and how they identify. I personally identify as queer, so I think that, I get lots of questions about that and explaining that. And I think that that's always going to be the case, and it's something that's just are prepared for. But I don't think that, focusing on one thing and providing, the gay community is not necessarily the best approach. That doesn't mean that you have to ask which letter you are, or which letter the person that you're speaking to is, or anything like that. Just to be mindful of the different experiences.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've touched a little bit on when we're talking about any kind of marginalized group. I think I've mentioned this before when I had talked about responding to racism, but chances are, if you are an ally and you are trying to be a good ally and a good support to this community, you might use the wrong language, you might use the wrong terminology, and a big part of that learning experience is getting that feedback and taking it in. You know, you may slip up and say, oh, you know, I want to support the gay community. And somebody might come to you and say, actually, that terminology isn't used. Like, why don't you try these ones? You know, being open and honest with yourself and being able to admit that, you know, whoops, things happen. Taking that feedback and really being able to apply it next time is so essential here. Mm-hmm. And people know when you're genuinely trying. Yeah.
I just want to touch quickly on the use of Two-Spirit at the beginning of the acronym as well, because I think that this was new to me as of a couple of years ago, and this has been kind of a shift that's been taking place as more conversations about reconciliation and decolonial work have been happening as well. But just to my understanding of this shift is that since Indigenous communities, which pre-contact were, you know, included individuals who were outside of what we understand as the gender binary, that we want to put Two-Spirit identity first at the beginning of the acronym to honor that Indigenous people, that we are here as settlers on this land, and that we want to put those experiences up front when we talk about gender and sexual diversity. So I come to this conversation as a white settler as well. So my explanation is not the best one probably, but that is an important piece, and that's a change that's been kind of in my experience a little bit more recent. And so just to put that piece in there as well for folks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Erin. That's a very important point as well. You know, I think when previous acronyms were used, I believe it was LGBTQ2S+. So just changing that, like you said, as an act of reconciliation is very important to honor and acknowledge. So moving on to the next point in regards to housing. We were doing a little bit of research on our end, and I found that there are some statistics around homeless youth in particular. And it seems like 1 out of 3 homeless youth in Canada identify as members of the 2SLGBTQ plus community. So why are these youth so disproportionately impacted by homelessness?
So 2SLGBTQ plus youth tend to experience distancing from their families at a much higher rate than, you know, folks that don't identify, because of beliefs and are, you know, typically, you know, kicked out of their home at earlier ages. And I think that I don't know what the statistic is as far as that goes, but definitely 1 out of 3. That is a huge number. 1 out of 3 homeless youth. And I think that, and please chime in, that's probably the main reason, is that family just, they're not supported in that way, or they don't feel safe in that home, so they decide to leave, and then finding housing after that, depending on your age, your employment status, all of that plays into getting housing and being unhoused as well.
Yeah, that was one of the first things I was thinking about too, Rebecca, is that that like direct experience, whether that's the fear of facing homophobia or transphobia in the home, or that like direct experience of it. Another factor I think too is that homophobia and transphobia, of course, has an impact on people who are out and who are aware of their identities, but also has an impact on people before they're out, and before they necessarily even have language to identify that they are within the 2S LGBTQ community. And so this can lead to all kinds of different behaviors to try and cope with whether it's they know that there's some kind of distress and they just don't know where it's coming from or what it is related to. Maybe that's like stress around gendered expectations from family, from, it can be even, from school, from other social spaces. or expectations around particular sexuality or sexual behavior. But then this can, we know that this distress, whether it's named or unnamed, can lead to all kinds of things like impacts on social relationships, on family relationships, impacts on school, on the ability to focus on people's grades and success in school or in different, relating to people in extracurricular activities, like all kinds of things that we think about in terms of the richness of life get influenced when people are having that background noise of something's wrong, these expectations don't fit with me, I don't know why, maybe I don't see people who are reflecting the experiences that I want to be having, or that feel more in line with myself. And in some cases we see that decreased sense of well-being, and we also in some cases see that numbing of different experiences in certain ways, whether that's with substance use that can be really common among 2SLGBTQ folks, especially youth. And I think about all those factors as some things where we might not necessarily know that someone has been kicked out or has left home at a younger age, directly related to their gender or sexual orientation, but that down the line that can emerge as a factor. But that, yeah, homophobia and transphobia impact all people, whether they are out or not.
Absolutely. And I would encourage anybody watching, if you haven't looked into the statistics when it comes to youth in this community in regards to mental health, substance use, self-harm, suicide rates, it is alarming. It is really scary to look at those numbers and see how disproportionately impacted youth in the 2SLGBTQ community are. So when we kind of move past that youth stage, so we have, let's say, an adult who is looking for housing or is already housed, are there any unique barriers to folks in the 2SLGBTQ plus community in regards to finding housing or their current tenancy?
I definitely think homophobia is also a fear and a very real experience. And even just being recognized as, I have an example in my own life, trying to find a house with my wife or a rental property with my wife. And there's always that question of, oh, are you roommates? Oh, are you, there's only one bedroom, it's just, there are just situations where those questions are just not, they don't feel good. So that kind of underlining experience of homophobia is very real in finding the housing, even if you have the ability to find the housing. If you're looking at housing, affordable housing, there isn't, well, there's a brand new building in Toronto, but there hasn't been a very focused how affordable housing drive for 2S LGBTQ plus communities specifically. So to have like a specific homeless shelter or something like that, to then help support folks to move into more permanent housing. But from the homophobia from the landlords, that is very real, and I think that is definitely a barrier. There are there's the Queer in Waterloo Region housing group on Facebook that I am a part of, and it's very active with folks trying to find housing. So trying to reach out in a way to a like community so that experience doesn't happen. So leaning on the community a lot for support is very, very huge. And community resources, I think, could be amped up a bit, when it comes to finding housing, having the funds to find housing, and maybe some support in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about not only like the challenge of finding housing and facing homophobia or transphobia in those spaces, but also then once you have housing, there are still people around you who you interact with in the course of being housed, and stigma or discrimination can come up in those relationships as well. and whether it's those, the subtle, like the unit only has one bedroom, like those kinds of things that imply, that imply heteronormativity or homophobia, or it's more direct things like threats of violence. Those things all, are on a spectrum of impacts of getting and being housed as 2SLGBTQ people. And I think also about like anything that involves government ID is going to be inherently tricky, especially for trans people, depending on the relationship between what gender marker is on their identification and on their records, and the way that they present themselves, or the way that they are perceived. And so this can, the threat of being outed unintentionally, needing to provide that government identification and then maybe perform gender in a particular way when that's not the way that they would like to perform it for the duration of their tenancy. These are all challenges that people are thinking about in their day-to-day of trying to get and stay housed. And this is, maybe a little off to the side, but I think as well about the related challenges of paying for housing, right? We know that, as Rebecca was saying, the availability of accessible and affordable housing is insufficient for the need that there is in our community and in a lot of communities. But I also think about, with young 2SLGBTQ folks who maybe leave home at a younger age, that then even if they are not needing like, emergency housing services, if they are able to find some kind of housing, a lot of the time the challenges that they have keeping a job or finding a job that's going to work for them puts them in this precarious economic place. I've seen a lot that 2SLGBTQ youth, again, they have that community that they lean on each other very much to get and keep stable housing. They depend on each other for food. They depend on each other for, trying to access the healthcare system. And these community relationships are very important in helping them to be okay. But it also means that strong interdependence can open people up to being very vulnerable when those relationships maybe go sideways, or when there are harmful dynamics in those relationships. It opens people up to the intimate partner violence in different ways when you depend on your partner to be able to afford to stay in your really inexpensive apartment because you've got a whole bunch of different young queers all living together, right? You all depend on each other, so it makes it harder to address things if they come up. So just these the challenges of then accessing the job market has knock-on effects, and the challenges as well with identification, with transitioning. If people, for older folks, if people transition at a later age, then you can be fully disconnected from your job history. If you change your name, if you're presenting in a different way, if you transition your gender, it's either you have to call all your old employers and let them know, if they're checking references, that they'll be, the person will be referring to you in a different way, or you just lose that job experience. And so the relationship, I think, between housing, because we live in a capitalist society, the relationship between housing and employment, especially for 2SLGBTQ people, can't go ignored, because those things come in a very big way, I think, in getting and keeping housing.
Yeah, I just also want to mention, I hadn't even thought about that, the loss of employment history and the loss of, landlord references as well. It's huge. That's a huge thing to think about. Wow. And also just the concept of dead naming with the trans community being, and working with Kitchener Housing as a affordable housing landlord. You have to share that if, every time you talk to someone, usually, because the system really isn't set up to accept, to be the process really isn't really set up to share that information in an easy way. So, it's like coming out every time you speak to someone. It's or somebody new or something like that. So when, as housing providers, when that happens, please understand that it took a lot of courage to get there and to have that conversation. And it's just, you know, I've personally experienced that with some residents in my history of working in affordable housing here and in the States. So being the recipient of that information, I felt very honored and to receive that and you know, held on to that and shared it with who I could and in the way that I could. But the system is not set up to necessarily easily change names, because you know, you need documentation and all of that, like you were mentioning, Erin. So yeah.
Can you just quickly define dead naming for us, for folks who may not know?
Sure, sorry. When an individual transitions, the name that was given to them at birth, and you know, I'm no expert, but this is my explanation. Erin, please chime in if you have any better explanations after. The name given at birth is considered a dead name, and the new name is the name that should be used. I'm not sure if there's a term for the new name, it's just the name. And dead naming is a very, very disrespectful thing to do. And it's calling that person by that old name after they've transitioned to a new name.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a piece where different trans folks, depending on their particular transition journey and their particular experience, some folks absolutely use the term dead name, other people use birth name. So both are acceptable. And other people also choose not to change their name or to use both. Really, everybody's comfort with different names at different times is personal. But that concept of like the previous name is like having that really strong negative association. It can be really common within the community. So treading very carefully, like Rebecca was saying, if that's information that the person has to disclose to you in the course of trying to find housing, holding that information carefully and knowing that there's vulnerability in receiving that information and that there's a certain amount of trust that they have to put in whoever has that information, because often people don't want to dredge up their birth names or their dead names unnecessarily. But this is the way that 2SLGBTQ people end up, traveling in the world, right? That these are constantly conversations that have to be had, especially for trans folks. These disclosures need to be made all of the time in order to access housing, healthcare, any government institution, like in many cases school. A lot of these systems are not really set up for name changes, for gender marker changes. And so when trans people are coming and are willing to work through that stuff to engage in a service, having that understanding that that's an act of vulnerability that honestly we shouldn't have to really engage in, but it's expected by the system. And so when people do that, that they're being vulnerable by doing so, and that we want to honor the work that they're doing by giving us that information, because it's not often comfortable information to have to give.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for that explanation. I think once we put some information behind terminology and share that, the knowledge, things just become a lot easier for everyone, right? I mean, I think this transitions nicely into, how can housing providers foster that inclusive community for 2SLGBTQ folks coming into that space? We definitely heard about a lot of barriers. So what can be done to kind of mitigate those situations that we talked about?
This is such a huge question and not one that we're going to be able to fully address. But the two hopefully quick things that I think of in terms of starting this journey of trying to become more inclusive is in particular in terms of gender anyways, if you can, looking at the ways in which your services are gendered. Where does gender come into them, whether it's, and sometimes there are funding limitations, sometimes there are things that we can't change or that are very complicated and long processes to change from a project or an agency level. But knowing, what kind of gender limitations are there, and can they be shifted in some ways on whether it's intake forms, even in the language that we use when we refer to people who are accessing services. Are we gendering people unnecessarily? And in relatedly, are we making other assumptions about about people's family units? Are we making assumptions about the relationships that people have when they're trying to access housing? And can we take those assumptive language pieces out of the interactions that we have and recognize when we're doing them and try and reduce those? The other quick thing that I always think about is, if, especially with systems where we can't, change all of the aspects of them, how can we as people try and buffer between what can be an inaccessible system and the service user? And so even if I know, my intake form is going to ask for your legal name, and, I need that for XYZ reasons on my end to be able to provide the service. But I also know our form is going to ask for maybe like a chosen name or a preferred name, some other name that you'd like to be used. Then we can have that conversation about, unfortunately, I have to ask you for your legal name. It's because of blah, blah, blah. Government asks me for this so I can provide you the service. Are you comfortable providing me with your legal name? And we can do a bit of that editorializing that says, I know that this is not a fun question for me to always have to ask. This is why I need this information. And those kinds of pieces can go a long way for having people understand that, like, there's a structure that we can't always change, but we're going to do what we can within that to make space for everyone.
Yeah, basically my thought process as well, Erin. Being, working at Kitchener Housing, and I think about our intake forms a lot, and I am the manager of resident engagement, so I work closely with, trying to engage with residents in a very equitable and accessible way. So right now we are undergoing the rewriting of our lease. So it is very gendered in unnecessary ways. And we're going to just dissect that and make sure that that is changed and brought up to date and all of that. So that is a huge thing to think about. Also thinking about the space, the buildings, how when we think about being accessible, we think about when we think about being inclusive to the 2SLGBTQ plus community, we think of the rainbow flags on the doors. So being kind of brought into that realm, you can go through a training. I'm pretty certain that Spectrum is providing that training for staff. And Erin, do you remember, or do you know the terminology for their program? I can't remember.
I'm not off the top of my head, but I'll see if I can find something.
Spectrum is the first LGBTQ plus community space in the Waterloo region. And thanks for looking it up, Erin. They provide training for businesses to be more inclusive and to bring staff into things like this. So that's something you could reach out to them for. And I can provide that information, Danielle, to you for that. And
I can include it in the YouTube link as well. So if folks are interested in participating in that training or learning more about it, it will be very accessible. Just look in the description, it'll be right there.
Perfect. But other than that, I think, Erin's example and thought process around knowing there's a system because I experience that a lot with my work, knowing there's a system and figuring out how to work within that system. And that does take a bit of knowledge. And I think first that training with Spectrum would be a really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like recognizing the ongoing nature of doing the work of moving towards having spaces and policies and processes be more inclusive, right? This is never something that happens overnight, and it's something that actively organizations and teams have to work on in a continuous way. So there's that training piece is one great place to start, and then to continue to having those capacity building things happen over time is really important. And I think and knowing that as well as individuals, that we're always going to be on our own, you know, we can be within a community of working on getting to a place of better inclusion, but that we as individuals also are going to be maybe in different places than our coworkers are, our colleagues. And so knowing, you know, who can we look to for assistance or support if it's, you know, I have a service user who I think needs some special accommodations. I'm not really sure exactly what I'm doing. You know, if we're comfortable being upfront about that it's like, I'm hearing that this form is really not jiving for you. Do you mind if I go away and try and find some other options or figure out what we can do, and then I can come back? Right? Being open to saying, I don't know what to do right now, knowing who your resource people within your team are, and coming back to folks and having that spirit of ongoing learning, because that goes a long way with people, with individuals, because typically people just hear no, or get that kind of really firm, like, this is the way the form is, and so take it or leave it. But having that softened a little bit can really help.
Absolutely. And I know our time is winding down here, but I also just wanted to throw out there that if you are a housing provider, if you are a service provider watching, just acknowledge that you are in an inherent position of power. And the way you interact with people, or the way you honor other people's journey, is setting an example for your tenants and is setting an example for the community. So I think, Erin, you had said that, you might be one small person in a very large system, but you are in a position of power and people are looking to you to decide how to interact with others. So, if you see somebody using slurs or using incorrect pronouns to describe someone, correct that and say it right out there, and let people know that, hey, you've made a mistake. Do you want more information on it? All right, so I think that also transitions nicely into our final piece here, which is just in our region, in Waterloo region, are there organizations that focus specifically on support for the 2SLGBTQ plus community?
Spectrum's the big one that jumps to mind in terms of dedicated to SLGBTQ services and supports. The other ones for me that I think about, so I'm a sexual health educator, so the kind of, when I think about sexual health and well-being, which can be a big piece for 2SLGBTQ folks, at ACCKWA we have some work that we do with 2SLGBTQ youth, and Shore Center and the Sexual Assault Support Center are also kind of the constellation of folks that I think about regarding some of those like health and well-being pieces that have really a lens of making sure that their resources are available for 2SLGBTQ folks. So those are the ones that I would mention, I think, on my end.
Yeah, same. I know that Waterloo Region Rainbow Coalition is another good place, but Spectrum is a great first. It's a great first.
Yeah. Sorry, I just thought about OK to Be Me as well, the OK to Be Me program through KW Counseling.
Sorry. Yes, exactly. I agree.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I can also include links to those services in the YouTube description as well. All right, well, Erin and Rebecca, that seems like our time today, but I want to thank you both sincerely for sharing your knowledge and taking this time to discuss with us. I think that sometimes Pride Month can be overcome with that celebration, but it's really important for us to get down into those root issues and continue to have the social development of inclusion. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing that.
Thanks so much for
Absolutely.
having me.
Thanks so much.